All right, and welcome back, everybody, to part two of the CIA's 1979 LSD reunion party. Where in part one, if you caught part one, thank you guys. Would like to see some more interaction going forward, thoughts, criticisms, feedback. We're constantly trying to fine tune this process. But looking forward to part two here today. We told you we'd bring it to you, and here we are, back with my good friend, farmer, researcher, author, truth warrior, seeking truth warrior, Duane Hayes, aka Diego Garcia of the bulletproofpub.com and on YouTube, the history of propaganda. So let me just show you guys that real quick, and then we're gonna go right into this video. Um, Here we go, right here, bulletproofpub.com, Aldous Huxley, how he hijacked Hollywood, a must read. Very, very interesting that this quote unquote great prognosticator delivering a warning via Brave New World to our society was actually a key engineer and architect of it. And his what grandfather, T.H. Huxley, aka Darwin's bulldog and propagandist, was a eugenicist and a propagandist of the highest order. And at the history of propaganda, Duane knows what propaganda is all about, right? Subverting, manipulating, and a master of twisting things to reach a desired means. And you see T.H. Huxley here with the hidden hand, and many of you understand what that means. Freemasonry, right? Darwin, there's that famous image of Darwin. They're into secrets here, secret oaths and secret meetings and secret agendas that we have to try and piece together through forensic historical research like Duane's put together here at Bulletproof Pub. A solid place to land, as we discussed last time, and I'll reiterate again here today. He lays it all out. Primary source documentation, gives you their books, their quotes from their own books. And it's really important that we do that in today's day and age of disinformation, misinformation, information overload. A key tactic, as we've discussed previously with Andy Rouse at the Deep Share, coming out of the Esalen Institute, that Mind War, from PSYOP to Mind War document, authored by people like Michael Aquino and other mind control manipulators there, talking about information overload and info wars being a key foundation for the future. And we're in the future now, ladies and gentlemen. This is the digital future that these folks like Aldous Huxley wanted to manifest and bring into the world. And we're seeing it, and we're going to get into the second half of that discussion here tonight and point out some key players and give you some more context for how the 60s counterculture and the whole quote unquote psychedelic revolution was completely manufactured wholesale by the Central Intelligence Agency. And Timothy Leary admits that. These people, these MK Ultra doctors and researchers, are meeting in this place, Oscar Janiger's home, openly, freely discussing this, laughing about it. In part one, to summarize, ladies and gentlemen, as you're seeing the history of propaganda, Duane's channel here, definitely get there, check that out. Maybe we'll play that Stubblebine interview. It's only like a minute and 40 seconds too. But quickly to summarize part one for you guys, if you're coming here for in anticipation of this part two, we discussed how Timothy Leary made it very clear that his number one goal throughout his activities and behaviors in the late 50s into the 60s as this quote unquote spiritual guru. His number one goal was to make pleasure the number one thing in the United States and the Western world, really, Western civilization. And that was one of the key motifs of Huxley's Brave New World, was promoting pleasure. There were mandated orgies in Huxley's society.
Mm-hmm.
If you were only engaged, they called it engaging in Huxley's Brave New World. If you were only engaging with 3 women or 3 partners a week, that was a problem. You were under like suspicion of um, falling outside of the norms in that society. So these mandated orgies, this complete debasement of what relationships actually mean. How are you going to have a solid family and raise a solid family when these ideas of selfless pleasure are just everywhere, just hitting you 100 miles an hour from every direction in the music, the movies. It's in the news. It's being promoted by all these different influencers. It's on podcasts now. The best athletes in the world promote this type of behavior. Fancy cars, materialistic consumption, endless consumption. And it's all about that instant gratification in Huxley's Brave New World. And Timothy Leary's highlighting that a CIA agent, Timothy Leary, is highlighting that his number one goal was to make pleasure the number one goal for American society, for Western society. And look where we're at in 2023 here, right? It's everywhere in the movies, in our society, in our conscious minds, our subconscious minds. And that's psychological manipulation. It's psychological warfare. We've been under psychological warfare for cradle to grave. Mm-hmm. Right. So that was a key part in number one. That admission from him, that was a bomb.
Yeah.
And that was an absolute bomb. And you're hearing CIA Dr. Humphrey Osmond and Leary and all these guys romanticizing about Aldous Huxley. So was he some great prognosticator, or was he a grand architect? And we pointed out in the last show that he was a grand architect. And we mentioned the video of former general of Army intelligence, Albert Stubblebine, admitting that Aldous Huxley was playing a key role. He wouldn't go on to elaborate, what his role was, but he acknowledged that he was a key player in MKUltra. And then you see these letters of exchange, and they're highlighted in Huxley's book Moksha, between Humphrey Osmond and himself about the name, how they were going to come up with the name for these different substances. Because, and not to get into it, because we're going to get into this video, but real quickly, the initial name of these substances was actually called schizophrenogen, or psychotomimetic, meaning to mimic psychosis. Do you think the counterculture of the 60s and the youth would have started some quote unquote revolution if they were called schizophrenogens or psychotomimetics?
Most likely not. No.
Do you think that millions of young sexually active adults, as Leary talks about, specifically targeting those young, what did he call it, neoteny, where you spread these ideas to the young, sexually active youth,
yes,
and they'll just kind of take it and run with it, and then they'll apply these different things into society as they go on to become philosophers and college professors themselves, researchers, scientists, doctors. They'll spread the good word, right? They'll spread the gospel. So those are some key highlights. They discuss things like genetics, and you can't talk about genetics really without talking about Gregory Bateson and Margaret Mead and the Macy conferences, cybernetics. Gregory Bateson being a key member of the CIA and the progressive movement, as you've highlighted over there at Bulletproof Pub. They discussed space migration, folks. We have a beautiful realm here where we can put our feet in the ground, where we can invest money on exploring this place, but they don't even allow us to do that. They want to dump billions of dollars into this fake idea of space migration. And we called that out in part one. Humphrey Osmond mentioned how the need for controlled cataclysms would would be ever present and ever growing in the future. And then Duane, you highlighted things like 9/11 and what that brought, the Patriot Act and the NDAA and the warrantless spying, and it laid the groundwork for the surveillance state. Are you going to say something there?
No, I'm actually looking for the doctor's name. That there's another doctor in the room that talks about shaking people up and how necessary that is.
Oh, Stoller, I think, was talking about where he's like, yeah, he's talking to Timothy Leary, we wanted you to shake people up. But remember, he said, but when I said shake people up, I didn't know you were going to hit them over the head with a ball bat.
Right.
So that was interesting. And I think where we're going to begin today is where Captain Al Hubbard, aka Captain Trips, aka the Acid Messiah, aka the Johnny Appleseed, because I guess he went by 3 different names, right?
Right, sure.
Where we're gonna start, where he gets into how he starts saying there's the question gets asked, do you think the 60s counterculture would have been possible without LSD? And then they kind of get into discussing these, and Hubbard jumps in and says, we've isolated all these other compounds, at least 15 other, he calls them harmaline compounds, and he mentions ayahuasca, and we're seeing the popularization of ayahuasca today via Aubrey Marcus and Graham Hancock and Joe Rogan and that whole clique. And so that's kind of where we're going to begin. Any thoughts from you, Duane, just generally on part one before we get into this? I think I did a pretty good framing there.
Yeah, you did excellent. That's excellent. I think one of the main things we're going to get into today that we mentioned several times in part one, we just didn't get to it, was the Willis-Harman connection to the changing images of man. But if I can share screen here, can I go ahead?
Yep. Should be able
to. I think a great place to start, we're going to go back probably about 2 minutes. We've covered some of this in part one, but I think, like you said, a great place to start this part two would be back again with that question: would the 60s counterculture have happened without LSD? Leary gets into the multiple cells that are going on in California, in San Francisco, and in Los Angeles, and how the agents in Los Angeles were doing a better job in a laid-back, cool way than everybody else. So we'll just let this roll. We've got some timestamps that we're going to stop and converse on some of the quotes and some of the things that they're saying, but I'm just going to press play here and we'll get into it.
Awesome.
They're coming along. Well, do you think the hippie movement would have come about without LSD or had its impact?
I think that'd be a totally different impact, isn't it?
What?
It'd be a totally different impact. I don't think it would be much less.
I think it was a necessary condition for it, really.
What about heroin? Do you think we would have had a heroin epidemic without LSD?
I don't think it has any bearing on it, Dr. Cohen.
May have had some bearing. I think it had some bearing, but...
Well, it's like saying when you have a CV thing, when you're giving people the concept of self-actualization, they can do things that formerly only experts can do. Naturally, they're going to be...
Well, there's other drugs.
You have a guy Princeton making an atom bomb.
Tim, there's other drugs. There's at least 15 others that act entirely differently. That would still come out that no one's ever said anything about, that we've isolated in the last 10, 12 years, that are far more remarkable than LSD. They really tell you which way you're going. All the harmaline compounds and ayahuasca and all that stuff. We've got all that.
I think another person we ought to mention as not being here, but here, is John Lilly.
Yeah.
Well, he will be. He will be.
Oh, he will be. Good.
He'll be here shortly.
John
What
will
a
be here.
courageous
And Laura Huxley
person,
will be
huh?
here too.
So Humphrey Osmond, right from the get-go there, to answer that question, would this hippie movement would have happened without LSD? And he said it wouldn't have happened as significantly or as impactfully, whereas everybody else seems to suggest that it could have through the use of other drugs.
She'll be here shortly. So everybody took their chances, I'll tell you that.
In some ways, I think that John, you know, we all work within the ranges and so forth. John has gone so far.
Talking about
and
John
taken
Lilly?
such risks that I just think he's
He'll
a
be
hero.
there when you get there.
Yeah. Boy. Yeah.
You know, Tim, I think everybody took risks in their own way, you know.
Oh, I
and
know.
not just flying around in the stratosphere one,
Yeah.
or, you know, or spending their time in tanks in the other. But there were people who were really working in areas that were very frightening and sometimes very awesome to them, and trying to integrate that and still move along and do what they had to do. And I think people like Art Chandler and so on, and Bill McLaughlin, and Ron Siegel, and
Those are some good names to research right there.
had you know, to walk out on a very, very long, narrow plank too and look around. And in their way, I think brought back some very good things, you know.
I think, you know, it's an interesting thing, too. As you go around the country, I'm sure you all have this experience. You talk to middle-aged, fairly respectable people in Tucson, Arizona, and they said, this is where the acid thing really happened. Tucson. In San Francisco, this is where it really happened. The Lower East Side, you know, they say that's where it really happened. And no one has ever really told us what was going on in Los Angeles during those years. I think much more was done down here. There was a much wider range. There were more doctors involved. There were more scientists
We had
involved.
Gerald and Aldous.
Yes, right, yeah. And Ivan.
Another Huxley
Then,
mention.
It was part of the coolness of the Los Angeles cell, whatever you want to call it, that they kept a, you kept a...
Would you mind not calling it a cell? Let's call it a cluster.
Our undercover agents in Los Angeles were very cool about, and yet they did more in a very laid-back way. And it's never been as public as some of the other, you know, the buses running around the country paying
Merry pranksters.
The visionary experience and all the things he was doing at Harvard, and the others, his residents and the rest that he was giving LSD to, they never had a visionary or an ecstatic or a mystic experience, but the whole thing was a California invention, he said. And he said, and the only time it ever
Wonderful, he
happened
says.
was when you crossed
You're
the
right.
Colorado River.
Stop it there for a second.
I'm reading John Mark's book.
Yep.
I think that's kind of important too. That goes back to the naming a little bit. How important the naming of the substances were, because they started marketing it as you know, an entheogen, and I don't have the timeline here in front of me when that fully became, like, started being used, but that was what you know, that means to, like, generate God within, the term entheogen. And they were I think they started popularizing that term on the West Coast. And given how highly suggestible we are, especially in regards to these substances, I think that's why a lot of these folks in California were having more mystical, quote unquote, religious experiences, was because that name entheogen was being used and marketed on the West Coast, and they were using psychedelic on the East Coast. So mind manifesting, which is where psychedelic comes from, no reference or suggestion towards some type of religious type of experience. So I thought that was important to reference there. One name I wanted you to just go into a little bit. Could you tell the audience a little bit more about John C. Lilly? Because before we get into the the LA aspect of this a little bit more,
Right. And that's actually
we're
something.
gonna get into time, and I want you to get into Henry Luce
Mhm.
and Charles Douglas
Yep,
Jackson.
they're coming.
Yeah, I know it's coming right up, so stay tuned for that. But could you just tell the audience a little bit more about? Because they mentioned how John C. Lilly was supposed to be there. I don't think he ends
Yeah.
up showing up, and he
Yeah.
also mentions Laura Huxley, which was Aldous Huxley's wife. So,
Mhm.
just
Through a
for
connection.
those of you that don't know, 1979, Aldous Huxley's now supposedly dead since 1963.
Yeah.
So, all this romanticizing about him and obviously he was dead for 16 years, but still having this impact, right? Still
Mhm.
having this impact. Like you said in part one, it's like he's not there, but it's like he's always there, which is kind of typical of Huxley, right? So
Yeah.
he had such a profound influence on these people. Obviously, if he was, arguably the director of the MK Ultra program. So, and
Mhm.
these are all CIA MK Ultra researchers,
Mhm.
so
So it's
if
interesting.
yeah,
Sorry, cut you off there. It's
no, go ahead.
interesting in that we talk about Huxley. These guys talk about Huxley. He's not there, but he's ubiquitous. And that is one of the terms on the logo of the Pilgrim Society and the Council on Foreign Relations. Ubiquite, or it's a Latin term meaning ubiquitous everywhere. So kind of speaks a little bit to that, even if he was alive, I'm not sure a high level grand strategist like Huxley would have been there. I mean, it's all speculation now, but he was always seeming to be in the background, far more willing to let guys like Leary and Hubbard, take all the press, including John C. Lilly. And John C. Lilly's he's another one of these guru shaman sort of thought leaders. He did a lot of work in isolation tanks with dolphins, trying to learn their language. And it's actually a Brave New World that made him change his studies. He was looking in. I think he was studying physics and read a Brave New World and changed uh, his whole master's towards biology and the study of everything going on here in the realm that Huxley had introduced him to through A Brave New World. So
So
he's,
another guy, another LSD advocate
yep,
doing far out research,
real far out.
incredibly influenced by Aldous Huxley, so much so where he changes the trajectory of his
Mhm.
life from physics to biology
Yep.
and sociology and these kinds of things, right?
Yeah.
The study of the mind and the body and how they work together. I think, yeah, Huxley was a bit of a sociopath and schizophrenic, where he believed that the mind was separate from the body. He used to say stuff like, um, I understand taking care of this, taking care of the mind, but taking care of this body thing just seems ridiculous to me, or something.
Hmm.
And it's like he used to believe that it was like separate from your body.
Hmm.
And he had some, yeah, he was a strange guy.
Certainly
I
was.
think Jan Irvin, regardless of where he ended up now, where what he's thinking and saying and doing now, I think he talked about how he compared him to Trotsky. Whereas Trotsky was one of the most infamous sociopaths in the world that's never talked about in our society. The only, type of genocidal maniac we hear about is Hitler, right? We
Yeah.
we never hear about Trotsky and Stalin and Lenin very much, even though they were responsible for about 65 plus million deaths,
At least.
horrific, torturous deaths, the Bolshevik Revolution. And Jan Irvin, I think, rightfully compared Huxley to Trotsky. It's just a different form.
Yeah. a more
right?
peaceable sort of revolution.
Yeah,
And what are they?
and
Go ahead.
it's just, yeah, go ahead. That's all I was going to say about
Okay.
that.
And the last thing I was going to say before we press play here is the nervous laughter in the room when John C. Lilly's name is brought up, and Sidney Cohen, the guy on the far left in the suit, says that he'll be there when you get there, Timothy. And he's referring to hell. And everybody in the room knows it, and that's why you get the laughter, is because, there is some admission of guilt in that laughter. They all, it cannot claim total implicity, or unwittingness. They're not totally ignorant or naive of the facts that are going on, even despite them being compartmentalized and having their own roles. You can see that as time goes on, they are very aware of what was happening and their role in it. So I just found that interesting. The room found it funny that, Leary and Lilly will one day meet in hell.
The Manchurian search for the Manchurian candidate, in which he says that the CIA turned us all on.
Well, that was
but
idea too.
I'd like to get your opinion of what started it. Was it Aldous Huxley's Doors of Perception? Was it Tim Leary? What made the mass use of psychedelics come on, would you say?
Well, notice we have to mention the name of Ken Kesey, and of course Allen Ginsberg was an indefatigable Zionist politician for drugs, and
But at the very beginning, what would you say?
So why he would mention Ginsberg as an indefatigable Zionist for LSD? Not sure why he made that comparison there. The one thing I think we mentioned in part one is that Ginsberg and Janiger are cousins. So the guy hosting this party here is cousins with one of the original beatnik writers.
Gordon Watson. Don't ever underestimate the effect of that wonderful, respectable...
He's mentioning...
Stop it real quick there, too, before we get into Watson.
Yep.
I wanted to stay on Ginsberg here for a second.
Yeah, sure.
We're seeing this crossover now between Zionism and the advocacy of these psychoactive drugs now. And we know that Zionism is a very real threat and a super big issue and super important issue.
Mm-hmm.
And we're not going to go into Zionism a whole lot tonight, but it is religious and it's political. And Adam Green at No More News does a fantastic job. I'll point everyone in his direction. If you want to learn more about the Zionist agenda, it's in the Bible, ladies and gentlemen. What the Zionist agenda is to have this one world ruled via Israel. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting how Allen Ginsberg was this like total degenerate poet beatnik. Mm-hmm. What did he say? Like something to the effect that when he was tripping on LSD, he was going to call the White House and Moscow, and he was going to resolve the Cold War or something.
Right.
While under the influence of LSD.
Yeah.
And, went to Allen Ginsberg, involved with Esalen, obviously studying at Harvard. Just a really interesting character, this Allen Ginsberg.
Yeah, for sure.
And cousins with this MK Ultra doctor, Oscar Oz Janiger, right? So I think he's just got such wacky ideas, and his writings are so disgusting and degenerate. If you actually start reading some of them.
And isn't it Neil Cassidy is the lead character in Jack Kerouac's On the Road, and he's a married prankster. So there's overlap between the late 50s beatnik movement and this 60s counterculture, which I haven't personally been able to get into. It is definitely a path of research that I'm very interested in knowing. Obviously, chasing things back to source is kind of my thing, and that those connections to the beatnik, that beatnik era is important too. It's just we haven't gotten there yet.
Right. Okay, so he's going to get into Gordon Wasson here. So go ahead
Yeah.
and
So they
run it.
mentioned Gordon Wasson and the discovery of the magic mushroom, because this is where LSD comes from.
A banker, Morgan Guarantee Trust banker, lying on the
He's the vice president of public relations at JP
saying
Morgan.
wonderful, wonderful. Oh boy, talk about Joe Namath commercials.
Sid, we ran close to 1,000 people through, and each of these people were people that had considerable influence in their own right, and they were bringing the message out.
Who turned on Cary Grant? So someone in this room did. Cary Grant.
Hartman did, and then I saw him a few times.
Yeah.
But we each of us had, and so this thing was just moving geometrically.
Janiger just
And
admitted
people
to
who had large audiences themselves.
seeing
And the rate of the way inquiries were coming in.
the actor they just mentioned several times after Hartman.
If that
Cary
continued,
Grant.
these people who then couldn't get it from us anymore would be seeking to get it elsewhere.
Yeah.
And it was that kind of a proportion that was taking place. That was, and keeping in mind, of course, that was just a relatively small ripple in a larger pond, but it was carrying a lot of impetus with it. And that might have been one of those things, and then those enclaves joining other enclaves and so on. But I think you're referring to the big explosion, or
The big explosion was when it came out on the cover story on all the popular magazines,
Right.
Life,
That
Saturday
was a
Evening
big-
Post,
yeah.
the whole business that were owned.
Well, Alice's book, Doors of Perception, Heaven and Hell, were extremely important among intellectuals.
Yes.
And Frank Barron was another person who was very active in the psychology.
Of course, it was Albert Hoffman who did it all anyway.
I know, right? Yes.
Allegedly.
I think really is directed at where did the young people get it? Because that's where the movement.
Well, there's the
started.
appearance of
Really
Willis
spread
Harman up against the wall there.
Yep.
Robert DeRock. That had a lot of effect where I was. In fact, I was very surprised when I saw
He
second
handled the Mendocino
psychedelic.
County chapter.
But didn't that drugs in the mind have a lot of effect on campuses and stuff like that?
Sure. That was Leary's job.
Could you stop it for a minute?
Sure. Yep.
Could you pull up the the image of Gordon Wasson on the cover of Time? I know I think you're gonna bring that up, but I think it's important to drill that home that Gordon Wasson, who was a key player in spreading these ideas in the search for the magic mushroom, was a vice president of public relations for the JP Morgan company.
Yep.
That means he's a professional propagandist. And I wanted to just highlight that because, you know, some of you might not be all that familiar with this, and we're trying to reach kind of anyone and everyone here, but I want you to just pull that image up. I mean, and drill that home that this guy, he was also a member of the Century Club, Gordon Wasson.
Yes, he was.
And he was a CIA agent. And again, these are the folks that started this quote unquote psychedelic revolution. And I wanted to just drill that home. That's him, right? Yep. And that's also Albert Hoffman there.
Yes.
Photograph of him on the right.
And that may be at the 77 psychedelics colloquium that we're going to close the show with. I've got some images from that too that happened 2 years before this video that we're going through, and it looks to me like Gordon Wasson's even there and all the usual suspects. And so that's 2 years before this. It happened in Santa Cruz. And so, yeah, Gordon Wasson is a super important person, super influential figure in history in understanding where exactly all this came from.
Yeah, I just wanted to highlight that.
Yeah, I'll see if I can find it as we go here and pull it up. But did I show that in part 1 too, maybe?
I think you might have shown it. I think we weren't really talking about it. It was like we were listening to the video or something. I think you had an image pulled up, but
we'll see if we can pull it out at the end here. Okay, so we're talking Gordon Wasson, and he's just mentioned Doors of Perception, Heaven and Hell. Those are both books written by Huxley as being catalysts. And then he mentions himself and his work at Harvard being arrested right here, I think.
One first major burst of publicity, is that what you're trying to focus on? Is that the
Well, there were steps all the way.
Yeah.
Huxley was
Yeah.
one of the first.
after we were fired from Harvard, that fall, every major magazine came out with a there was a cover story in the Saturday Evening Post.
Yeah.
The
And that
dangerous.
spread it.
Yeah, there were
Very
three
fast.
different stories in Playboy. So that was it was the firing from Harvard plus the fact that Henry Luce was somewhere always behind the scenes doing certain things. Plus so many people in Los Angeles and so forth. But that was.
Tim was more responsible than anybody for
Yeah, Tim,
that.
wasn't it the calculated goal of if to cause that kind of spreading?
Yeah. I remember coming to Cambridge one time when a little article in Time came out.
Yeah.
Remember? Yeah. And I walked in there and he said, "What do you think about the Time article?" It was really devastatingly bad for LSD. I thought it was terrible, I said. Yeah. Tim said, "We thought it was great." You let the kids know that there's something here, they'll know it, you know. It doesn't make a difference whether it's bad, good, or indifferent.
Well, I want to point out, though, that the picture, we all know that here and now study pictures more than they do long columns. The particular picture of this article with all these guys actually filled with socks, but that's all right. It had an incredibly beautiful young woman sitting, taking the test, and it had standing behind her Alan Watts, a beautiful female Hindu guru named Gayatri Devi, and myself. Now, the signal content of a picture like that was much more important than the little words that are being written by some clerk at Time magazine.
See, they understand the power of images.
How about McLuhan?
We take them for granted. He mentions McLuhan there, too.
That what else could happen in a person's life that short from a religious conversion that can fire them up with the sort of zeal that we saw in the few people that we began to use it with. In other words, perhaps not everybody went out.
Psychosis.
Yeah, but it was a contagion. It was certainly a contagion.
Contagious psychosis.
Contagion. The words that they use to describe it.
It was a chance. It was a chance for everyone to go to the carnival all at once, you know. Okay. And they all came out of that place and they were ready to really spread the word. I'll tell you.
That's not true. Talk about.
Yeah.
That's the truth.
Had the sacrament, and that's how they behaved in those days.
pause it real quick. I just want to highlight the book that you just held up from.
Of information.
Yeah, Marshall McLuhan. He's a famous Canadian. He's really, he's famous for media being the message. He's a society thought leader as well, way back, highly respected. And he did a version of the Trivium called the Classical Trivium, and I haven't even read it. I just got it through the mail not too long ago. But I think that this is where they start to deviate people. You know, the Trivium that we learn, grammar, logic, rhetoric, and how that's going to allow us to liberate ourselves, to see ourselves in our true and proper place, and to then make necessary, you know, more sophisticated changes to our lives, be more adult about our situation. You know, these books will come out and they'll try to veer you from that direction. And I think that we see that with the 60s counterculture and the LSD movement in general. But yeah, with books like Marshall McLuhan's The Classic Trivium, it's meant to just disorient you a little bit. And when we talk about orientation to a social engineer or a political or social scientist, orientation of the mind of the society and the individuals within it is very important, as if you are steering a ship.
Right, and that's where cybernetics and government, the etymology, they both align to meaning to control or to steer.
Yeah.
In addition to, you know, the interpretation of, you know, government to control the mind, as many people have said before, right? Yeah, to control and to steer. And I just wanted to again reinforce. We just kind of mentioned it there, Henry Luce. Could you just give a little bit more detail on? I mean, Skull and Bones. Like, just give a little brief synopsis of Henry Luce and Charles Douglas Jackson,
right,
who worked for the government as a propagandist and also finds himself at time. And if you could just talk about those characters there, and because how important that Time Life article was in spreading this idea of this search for this divine mushroom, right? Where I had heard that Maria Sabina, who was the quote unquote shaman that R. Gordon Wasson was seeking out in Mexico, she ended up writing a book later. She couldn't read or write, but she wrote a book along with help from somebody, where she was talking about how mushrooms had never ever been used to seek a religious experience or to try to find God. All these people, once Gordon Wasson goes back to the United States, they publish that Time Life magazine article, and Playboy publishes their articles, and then that's getting circulated on college campuses everywhere throughout the United States. And it's really taking effect. All of a sudden, you have thousands of people flocking to Mexico to seek out this religious experience, where Maria Sabina was like, why did you come here? Are you sick? And they're all like, no, we're not sick. We're just seeking God and all these kinds of things. And she wrote a book saying that the mushroom was never actually used to seek a religious experience or to find divinity or anything along those lines. It was used as like a purgatory agent to aid in detoxifying someone's body, to heal them of dis-ease within the body. And that actually makes a lot more sense. Using a fungus that's not going to kill you, right? There's some mushrooms out there that will kill you. But there's these other mushrooms that aid in the individual purging and getting a lot of those toxins that are wreaking havoc in your system. And that's how she was using them traditionally there. So I thought it was important to maybe just give us a little bit more on Luce and C.D. Jackson, because I know C.D. Jackson, you get into him and your work. If you could just give us a little bit more there.
Yeah, I think that, the important thing to know about Henry Luce is that he is Skull and Bones. So he's affiliated with a lot of these other important figures relating to other aspects of our work. So you can start to see that there's a coordination between all aspects. And when we're talking about the psychological manipulation of society, Huxley admits himself and is stated in Stanford Research Institute, Changing Images of Man, of the necessary aspects of society. There's 7, I think, that they label in the Stanford Research Institute study that they have to infiltrate. So when you take a wider lens look at what's going on, as these men are here, you can tell that they're looking at things from a macro perspective. How many ever years later, you can see that men like Henry Luce and C.D. Jackson are really just propagandists. Time Life is invented really to be a propaganda pamphleteer. It's just, we don't recognize it as such, but really all literature that is out in Western culture, in the culture industry itself, is basically propaganda. C.D. Jackson, he was the president of Time Life. He's worked with psychological warfare divisions during World War II. There's some extra information that we're not really ready to reveal yet about C.D. Jackson. But yeah, I mean, I could probably offer this to do with the JFK assassination, is that the Zapruder film is given to C.D. Jackson. C.D. Jackson manipulates it long before it ever becomes public. I think I've mentioned that already. But
yeah, I think we got into that on your part 2, which I think it was on Andy's show.
Yeah,
you said that the Zapruder film was was handed to this guy who was an expert on psychological warfare and served in the OSS, which was the precursor to the CIA in World War II, and later as special assistant to Eisenhower. It's right on his wiki page.
He's a very interesting fellow to be looking at.
Later served in a position at the UN. So now you're talking about internationalism, and you said that he was like a key internationalist, key in establishing Bilderberg. It's right here.
Yeah, right. So
I mean, this guy is does it get much more all the little
than him
coincidence dings going off this guy? And he's, what do you know, he's involved at Time, an executive there, and they're pushing this, these substances that go on to sort of, really co-opt the anti-war movement of the 60s, the real and growing and professional anti-war movement that already existed well before the Doors and the Mamas and the Papas and all these bands of the 60s. And they became these pseudo, Dave McGowan in his book, Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon, we know, talks about how these guys sort of became the pseudo leaders of the anti-war movement. Yeah. And they all came from military intelligence families. And most of them were incredibly right-wing, and some were actually doing operations themselves personally.
Before they were famous even.
And you can read all about that in that book, Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon.
Yeah, it's a great book.
It's well documented.
Yeah, and they mentioned Starks. He wrote a book too on the 60s counterculture. They just mentioned him in this earlier, but I think himself, that was a CIA funded project. And the one link I want to make here too is that you mentioned that this kind of thing was going on long before the 60s counterculture. It was going on long before Aldous Huxley. It's really this old world establishment. The Century Club is, where we find all of these guys hanging out together. They're all Pilgrim Society members. So you see a combination of British and American interests aligning. They're paralleling, internationalism, imperialism, Zionism, colonialism. They all have the same end game. So they find common interests, and you were mentioning common interests earlier, and that's really the same thing. It's really out of a need of world domination, and I know it's a tiring trope, and people have heard it enough, but this is actually literally what is going on, is the battle to control the world and to create it into the image that these people want, these experts want.
Yeah, this transhumanist future, which they became proponents of and were pushing for, throughout the Changing Images of Man study that they did there. And, Terence McKenna, all these folks, Timothy Leary, they went on to become transhumanists.
Yeah.
And, they were selling these experiences as being spiritual and enlightening. And, people say, oh, you see brighter colors and you see the life coming off the trees. And it's true. You actually do. I've taken these substances. Duane has also taken these, and it can bring you closer to nature. And you can have some good experiences out of it, but you really need to be careful. I talked about that with you and Andy. Given what we know about these substances, where they come from, the types of suggestions we've been given about the experience. And you know, these folks are just the same kinds of people are popping up everywhere, and they're all connected in these
Yep.
secret societies and these
Yep.
secret
Societies are
clubs:
all common.
Bilderberg, Bohemian Club, the Century Club, the Hellfire Club, Skull
Yeah.
and Bones, Phi Beta Kappa, as you point out a lot.
And they're all
Um,
related.
it's just, and you know, we see the average person, you know, myself, a bartender, you know, just continuing to struggle in this life, and finding it harder to pay the bills and keep the lights on and keep food on the table. And folks like this are thriving and, you know, wealthier than they ever have been, ever. And there's a reason for that. That's all we're trying to say. It's obvious there's a reason.
Yeah.
Right? It's a manufactured plan, and this is just one tiny little aspect of how they go about creating this world. Right? Dumb us down, medicate the shit out of us. You know, people that have heard my story know, right? 50, 30, 40 pills at once, right? Going to the psychiatrist, they're giving me Adderall, they're giving me Xanax, they're giving me Suboxone, they're giving me gabapentin. I mean, and I went in as someone who was addicted to pills, and they're throwing more pills at me. It makes no sense. Unless they're trying to usher in a world where we're just medicated and we're docile and we don't care whether or not we're a slave. You know, I want to be a free man. And I want you out there in the audience, you and your family and your posterity, your children, your grandchildren that you don't have. I want you to be free. And so does Duane. And that's why we're doing this here today. I just wanted to throw that in there because it's so important. The average person, that's you out there listening. This is for you, right? We need to understand where we've been, how we got here, and know that we can actually learn about these things, the negative side of the world, the darker sides to the world. We can learn about them, and we can empower ourselves and our families to defend against that and build and create beautiful things like Duane's doing with the Hell's Half Acre Farm, and you know, something I aspire to do myself. And so this is what it's about: developing ourselves, not so we just meditate and do yoga forever while the world burns around us. Like, if meditation and yoga brings you some peace and makes your body feel better, by all means do it, but get activated and don't just, you know, throw away your care for what's happening to the young children in Palestine or whatever else is going on around us. We need to get care enough to develop ourselves and activate to create and come together and do beautiful things together. And it's totally possible. It really is. It's not that hard. You know, I know life's complicated. We have emotional pain things that we're going through, and but it's really not that hard. We can secure our freedom once and for all, and put this manipulative, subversive, intrusive, dominating control system, and we can just shatter it in 1,000 pieces, and move forward in a different light. You know, and that's what I want to do.
Yeah, just by changing our minds.
Yes,
As simple as that. Just not being afraid to change our minds when confronted with information that contradicts what we always thought. And so the one other thing I want to mention here about Luce and his role is that just as Huxley, McKenna, Leary all admit to having their role, you can see that they're different. But Luce is no different in that he has a role too, and that is to propagandize, to disseminate that message. And you know, Time Life is a piece of Americana, really. And so when we're looking at the two pillars of propaganda, I always mention this: they need a brick and mortar building and then a periodical or a quarterly magazine of some sort to disseminate the information. Well, you can see it here, that this is the role that Henry Luce is playing, is that, you know, he's connected through the Century Club to all of these men. There's obviously an overarching plan that all of them are involved in. whether it's coming out of the Century Club or not, I would say if I was a betting man, that yes, most certainly this is where these plans are being concocted, is inside these gentlemen's clubs, specifically the Century Club, because it's connected to the Bohemian Club. And this is where
the East Coast, right? You got East Coast Century Club based out of New York, right? And then you have the West Coast, Bohemian Grove, and San Francisco.
Yep.
So you got both coasts, and then you got everything that's going on in LA that you've explored and revealed for us. It's just, it's everywhere. And really important pillars.
And when you start to put it all together, you create a mosaic, and you can start to see that there is an actual picture here that's seeable, first of all, admittable, and then there's something we can do about it. I think the message coming through the television and that it's been fed into our minds our whole lives is that all of this is far too much for us to comprehend, let alone try to overthrow. And it's not that we're trying to overthrow anything in a physical revolutionary way. It's changing the way that we think about things, stepping outside of the Western culture industry, because this is really the assembly line they put your mind onto. They get you distracted into materialistic interests, like Andy was discussing earlier. And we're just asking for people to re-engage in the world that exists, to not be afraid to look at some of the things that need to be looked at, because, you can break it down to just personal levels. And what happens when you fail to pay a bill and you just say, I'll get to it. Eventually it grows and grows. It doesn't go away. So the best thing to do is to cut it off at the beginning, and to take care of these things as they come into our life, rather than putting them off, waiting for another day, kicking the can of history down the street, because they are going to come home to roost. And the longer that we delay that, the worse it's going to be. Now, for a guy like me that's done a lot of deep research, I'm more optimistic than most, because I'm starting to see it for what it is. And it's really a front, the whole thing, just as they have fronts for companies. This whole thing, this is a front. It's built into the architecture. They build these giant government monolithic stone structures so that it psychologically works on you. You can't just take your car and smash it through the window if you're frustrated about your government. It's going to take more thought to do that, or more force. And we are saying that, the intellectual side of us and our ability to think our way through things is the way we're going to win here. I don't think Andy, and I'm not advocating violence at this point. We're definitely saying get active. And so this is one way you can determine whether you're doing something healthy for us or not. Is there action in what's going on, or is that absent in your life? And so this is what they do. They will give you all kinds of information through the two-dimensional screen that makes you feel like you are active in this world when you're still sitting on the couch. So be cognizant of what is going on with you physically. If you aren't actually facing some of your fears and getting active, then you aren't doing enough to help us turn the tide of the way that this thinking has gone on for over 100 years through programs like this that we're exposing. This really shows the inner workings and the mindset and the motivations that create the actions. And so here we are, this generation, 2023, everybody living in this year now should be able to see, 100 years of history. It's pretty plain to see that, this is
World War I, a lie. World War II, a lie. Vietnam War, a lie. They admit it. The Gulf of Tonkin, Vietnam, a lie. Never happened. 9/11, lie. Oklahoma City bombing, lie.
Right.
Lies. Weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, lies.
We're still looking for the WMDs.
Yeah, still looking. Guys, the lies pile and they pile up, and they're
like Bill.
Yes, like my bills. And it's why do we continue to trust them? I don't know. It's, we bring up that that dynamic of it's like being in an abusive relationship, and
Mhm.
Stockholm syndrome, and we're
Yeah.
afraid to venture out into the unknown, and
Yeah.
we don't want to be alone, and of course we weren't taught how to think critically
Yep.
and question things, and that's where the public indoctrination system is been so impactful and influential and dumbing us down. That's one angle, and then what we're talking about today, this pharmacological angle that comes out of these minds here, these CIA MK Ultra researchers, and works, literary works like Brave New World, and you talked about how the pharmacological means and propaganda really ramped up and escalated after the Changing Images of Man study,
Mhm.
where they're just, that's their answer for everything
Mhm.
is pharmaceuticals, petroleum-based pharmaceuticals.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's, you have the education that we didn't receive, the classical education we didn't receive, and
Yes.
you have the deliberate targeting and distribution of pharmaceuticals,
Yep.
and the incentive structures that exist for nurses and doctors and psychiatrists to push them. And me working for CVS, an insurance company, a pharmacy that bought an insurance company, and Aetna has firsthand knowledge from the inside that these people don't care about your health. They care about money and control.
And is that so hard to believe that
Of
governments
course,
and corporations conspire to make money,
of
especially in
course
this
not.
capitalist world? No, these are not conspiracy theories. This is actually happening. And so we are going to get into now, I think, uh, the Changing Images of Man, one of the founders and creators of it, Willis Harman, who up until this point has literally been a wallflower. Um,
Yeah, I don't think he said a word.
yeah, and so then the other connection I wanted to make there with the Changing Images of Man, they reference both Huxley brothers, but again, they're not part of this study, so they're ubiquitous. They're here, and they're mentioned because they are involved in the overall process that is inspiring some of these studies, but they're careful not to be associated with it in ways, and I would say that that's the same as the degrees of separation that intelligence agents or diplomats are going to always want to have for an alibi. So Willis Harman coming up.
Information. And that was the kind of zeal that we experienced.
There's people in this room right now, if we decided to do anything in the next 6 months,
Yeah.
that was really right.
Yeah.
That was right. Had to be. We could do it.
I'm not so sure. It's amazing how many times the same mistakes are repeated. When I first came to Los Angeles, I was working with Murray Jarvik, who's over here, and
I'm Murray.
we were setting up some LSD studies to do it, and with marijuana, a few other drugs. And Allen Ginsberg came by the lab to visit me one day.
Yeah.
Showed Allen around, and as he was leaving the lab, one of the administrators in the building, it's over UCLA, saw him and allegedly saw someone smoking a joint in his entourage. On the basis of that, there was a big flap. And it was like another Harvard psilocybin fiasco on a much smaller scale. There was absolutely no truth to any of the charges or anything, but it was an uncomfortable situation, anyone wanting to do research with these drugs, even though there was authorization, there was all the DEA forms, there was all the necessary precautions that were taken according to law. There's a lot of resistance to doing those things. And I've encountered that again and again in every university I've gone to trying to set up these studies. And it takes a year and a half of paper. I think Murray took us a year and a half of paperwork.
I think we're in the dark ages.
To get our proposal approved finally.
Drug research of that type.
And the one thing that kept on coming down, they didn't mind marijuana. We were giving marijuana had 11 hallucinogens listed on the proposal. And the only one that the proposal kept on coming back for was LSD. They said, oh, you're going to use LSD, you got to do a follow-up. You got to do a 90-day follow-up, you got to do a year-and-a-half follow-up.
30-year follow-up.
They didn't care about the mescaline, they didn't care
30-year
about the psilocybin.
follow-up.
They didn't care about ketamine, which we can give to children. And it's the only drug that we can give to children without any formal, any hallucinogen that we can give to children without any formal studies.
Well, why is that? Why are these so...
Because it's a normal surgical anesthetic given to hospital patients.
Stop it real quick on the ketamine.
We're talking about
Ketamine is getting really popular now with the youth.
Really? Okay.
I have a friend whose son is like 26, 27, and it's being used a lot.
Really?
In these circles with the like the mid 20 somethings, which is kind of who he's talking about, the young sexually active, youth.
Yep.
And he's got, I mean, he's had so many problems, ended up in the hospital. Actually in 2020 ended up in the hospital. And
from ketamine, the use of ketamine.
Drinking a lot, doing ketamine and drinking. Right. It's this really intense, psychoactive. That was what Steve-O there, the guy, the jackass guy.
Yep.
He was addicted to that. I would talk about this K-hole or something.
Okay.
So I thought that was interesting that they were exploring that too, right? They're interested in any substance that
anything. Yeah. That's why they went to
act like this soma, right? This drug that could be used to control society and to just get us in that cycle of like, let's just tune out, let's escape, And that's what I did for years, 35 years of my life. It was a constant escape: drugs, alcohol, sex, porn, mindless entertainment, sports, movies. And he also mentioned Murray Jarvik, the guy that's talking about doing the studies. I wanted to mention him real quick. Psychopharmacologist, inventor of the nicotine patch. Was among the first scientists to study LSD. Professor at UCLA, taught professor of psychiatry, pharmacology. He goes on to receive an undergrad at a bachelor's degree in the City College of New York.
CCNY.
Really important. University of California, Los Angeles. So UCLA, PhD from UC Berkeley. So liberalism and communism, trading ground there. And his MD from UC San Francisco. Right. And what I wanted to point out about him in particular, you and I talked about this offline. His son, Lawrence Jarvik, ends up going to make a documentary called Who Shall Live and Who Shall Die. 1982 documentary film that basically blames the United States on the German Holocaust. So we have an MK Ultra doctor, Murray Jarvik, professional in mind control operations. His son, is going on to make propaganda films about World War II,
right?
Blaming the United States for not doing enough to stop or prevent the German Holocaust, not doing enough to get European Jews out of Germany. And this is the framing. Just like we saw with Ken Burns' new documentary that just came out last fall. Same narrative. You and I discussed this, blaming the United States for not doing enough to prevent the German Holocaust. And There's all kinds of scholars and academic researchers that have called that event into question.
Mm-hmm.
And we know what happens to them in certain countries. There's Holocaust denial laws. So there were people are, I think in your country, Canada, it's illegal to question that event. So just wanted to point that out, that a CIA MK Ultra researcher who's learning about how to control people's minds, his son, Lawrence Jarvik, a documentary filmmaker, creates this "Who Shall Live and Who Shall Die" 1982 documentary about blaming the United States. And there's this narrative out there right now. Jonathan Greenblatt, the head of the ADL, wrote a book called "It Could Happen Here."
Yeah,
pushing this new narrative about this. And he had some other interesting familial connections. He had a nephew, Robert Jarvik, developed the first artificial heart.
I was just going to say, when you said it that way, Jarvik. Yeah, because that is the first ever artificial heart, the Jarvik heart. That's right. So that's something else too.
So you got Murray Jarvik himself, the inventor of the nicotine patch. You got his son, this master propagandist, coming from this line of CIA MK Ultra researchers. And this is another interesting one. His other nephew, Dr. Jonathan W. Jarvik, professor of biological sciences at Carnegie Mellon and founder of Spectra Genetics. I don't even know what that is.
No.
Do you know what Spectra Genetics is?
I do not know, but that would be something I'd be very interested in researching. Yep.
It sounds like it ties in great with these Brave New World Huxleyites, because in Brave New World, if you haven't seen it, every member of society is manufactured in a lab artificially.
Yep.
There's not a single birth naturally. And when they actually go out to the Savage Reservation, which some members of the Brave New World Society leave the Brave New World Society and they go on vacation to go and visit these quote unquote savages who have natural births and don't take soma.
Still growing food from the soil.
Yeah, who actually read the savage in Brave New World. We know he was read Shakespeare, and which is also a propagandist, right? But at least he was a reader. He was thoughtful. He had care. He had a heart. It was, you and I watched that clip. Maybe we'll have to show the audience that at the end. But that was awesome. That's
and in Brave New World, the word family, mother, father, they're all not outlawed. They're just not used anymore. And when people use them, they're oddities within society, right? Giving birth is looked at as a disgusting sort of old relic of history. And then I would also add about this Jarvik and the nicotine patch. These guys are all around addictive personality. No matter what it is, they are trying to capitalize or exploit our addictive personality. And then if you're going to talk about Jarvik's son writing a book, Who Shall Live and Who Shall Die, about the Holocaust, all of a sudden he is now in the same circles as the previously mentioned C.D. Jackson, Henry Luce. C.D. Jackson's there at one of the first ever liberations of the concentration camps. He's there with Billy Wilder, who is a Hollywood director. No, those two things are facts, that they are the two first people to broadcast or to film the liberation of the concentration camp at Buchenwald. That turns into a public relations thing where they put a bunch of German atrocities allegedly to have been created by Nazi scientists on a table, including shrunken heads and human lampshades made from human skin. Those are all debunked or discredited today. These are
not real, never happened.
No.
And it was used to justify well, the execution of many,
Yeah.
German leaders and people at the Nuremberg trials
Yeah.
who were had these incredibly coerced, testimonies and were basically tortured to give a certain narrative about their involvement in the activities of the camps. And keep in mind that without going down that rabbit hole here, but the United States had camps, and it was during war, and none of that's actually being disputed, that the existence of camps were used. It's the scope and scale of what's, how do we define how do we define the Holocaust? What does that actually mean? And you're seeing things like what you just mentioned, the soap being made from Jewish fat, the shrunken heads, the lampshades, all these different pieces of propaganda that came out from people like C.D. Jackson, who was specialized in psychological warfare for the OSS, the precursor to the CIA.
Specializes in lying to people.
He's a career professional liar and in bed with the military. And why is he involved in the production of this film that's then disseminated to the entire Western world? And most people weren't even allowed to go into the camps in Poland. That was liberated by the Russian army. And the Soviets never told a lie before or anything, right? They're the ones who get to provide the narrative of the gas chambers and the kilns and this mass death. And they, all this research has been done to debunk the photos that were used, and this is emotional manipulation, lies, propaganda, emotionalism. This is how they do it, folks. And you're looking at these professionals in mind control and psychological operations in this one room. It's so damning that they're all here together.
It's actually incredible that they allowed this to happen to me.
I know. Me too, but maybe, how they like to mock us. Maybe it was part of that. I don't know. Some of these occult researchers might say that, right? Occult mockery. Mark Passio's used that term before. Many others, but
I would say that it was probably, done to document it. And whoever the filmmaker was behind the camera there is a friend of all of these people, and it was most likely meant as documentation, not as mocking or whatever. I'm not sure that was sort of the intent with this group of people, but
yeah, possibly not.
Regardless, it's recorded and it's here forever for all of us to learn from our history. Because like you just mentioned about ketamine and Rogan and, all of that stuff, it's going on today. So once we recognize the words and the program that's being done, we can now see the people today that are filling the same roles as Leary and Janiger. And hopefully we gain enough knowledge and we can avoid this situation entirely.
Moments.
Yeah, right.
The article that Murray and Frank wrote in Scientific American, and again, at another level, was one of the Everest points in all this.
Yeah.
Thank you for that, Murray.
Indeed.
He's at an Everest point,
Who may come
Jarvik.
today, who really deserves a great deal of consideration in all this, is Nicholas Purcell. And he may come a little later. He said he was going to be here. Nick is a remarkable man, very quiet and in his own way, went to Europe at the very beginning of all this, and I suspect in writing the book that he may have been the very first person to use LSD in America, although that's often accredited to Wrinkle in Boston. And the reason is that he was sitting, he's a Hungarian, and Hungarians get into rather interesting places. And he was talking to Stoll, the young Stoll, who he said, so he told me, said, by the way, Nick, I don't know if they're talking Hungarian or what, he said, there's a few things I think you ought to try, and he reached into his waistcoat pocket and took out a few vials, and then, here, when you get a chance, he said, you may want to try that. And that was before, to my knowledge, before Wrinkle ever got the material. At the fairs in Hanover, I said to him, the usual subject about what happened to LSD. He said, hell, the reason we gave it up, he said, because we couldn't sell it.
But he simply take the wrong view. It wasn't the selling, it was the sales that went with it.
Well, I guess so. But I remember Tim coming to the house one morning, and we were all having breakfast, and Robbie, my boy, was just a little fella, and Tim was wearing a hearing aid. I don't think you... Tim had a twinkle in his eye. You know, he looked like a real picaresque, Spanish-Irish kind of a guy. And he said, what the...
Okay. So we'll find... We're talking about Nicholas Purcell here, and so we'll just share this for a moment. This is Nicholas Purcell doing LSD experiments on witting subjects, artists. And I just want to show you that his name is on here. Oh, there's Nicholas Purcell, MD, Department of Physiology, University of Southern California Medical School, Los Angeles. So this is who they are talking about, the Hungarian. So he's inducing psychosis in people and recording the events. So we'll just give you a minute or so. That's just to give you a feel. And this is on YouTube. You can go look. I would just to put in Nicholas Purcell, Department of Physiology, LSD, and you'll find it.
Courtesy of Sandoz.
Just showing that this is real. He's affiliated. He's a part of the establishment. And they state that he's even going to be there at that meeting.
LSD was isolated by Stoll and Hoffman in a Sandoz pharmaceutical company of Basel, Switzerland. When in 1943 Hoffman became temporarily psychotic through accidental ingestion of the drug, the door swung wide open for research into the nature of the schizophrenic process and, in a larger sense, into the biochemistry of psychoses. TV's Paul Coates of Confidential File undertook to film a model psychosis in our laboratory in an attempt to impress upon the public, through a case of artificial insanity, that the mentally ill is not inhabited by the devil.
So he's put it into that cup, and he's going to have the patient drink that.
Into 4 short hours will not be shown here. Our attention will be focused on the experiences of our volunteer subject, Bill.
It's exactly 12 o'clock, and we're ready to start this experiment. I'm going to give you this cup that contains lysergic acid, 100 microgram. Will you drink it?
Oh my God, dude.
How did it
Drops her down.
It had no taste. How did it look? Colorless.
Now, would you tell me your name, please?
William Millark.
And what is your address?
3540 The Paseo, Los Angeles, 65.
And your age?
Paseo.
34.
So I just wanted to include that to show. Oop, better turn that off.
Knowing what I know, I'll never trust another doctor in a white coat.
Yeah, that's pretty tough.
I mean, this whole MK Ultra, CIA mind control, it never went away, never stopped. It's, I mean, these people are constantly today, psychiatrists, psychologists, they don't know what the hell they're doing. And some of them are much more informed than others and know that they're making people sick and unwell by giving them these substances. But there's a lot of psychiatrists and just psychologists that are indoctrinated into thinking that these drugs actually work.
Yeah.
And they were educated to believe that and to internalize that, and they haven't reached a point getting to the point of questioning that paradigm. And a lot of times their careers require that they don't question the paradigm. Their licenses, their ability to earn a living requires them to go along with this. But I will never, and I'm not a doctor and I'm not giving medical advice, but I would never trust these folks ever if you're listening out there.
Yeah.
You know,
And I would say that generally guys like you
way.
and I going into a doctor's office to see a family doctor are going to have a far wider, deeper worldview than they do. They've spent their entire life being told that they are the best and brightest. We know that 20% of the population has to manage the other 80, and out of that 20% are nurses and doctors. And like you say, it's difficult to get somebody to understand something when their paycheck depends on them not understanding it. It's a famous Upton Sinclair quote. He's a socialist sort of muckraker writer as well, but the point is well taken. And yeah, I'm kind of on the same page as you as far as trusting doctors. If I have a broken arm or a broken leg or something like that, then those are the people I want to go to. But I think over the last 20 years especially, they've just become drug pushers. They are your neighborhood drug dealer. The shoes aren't hanging off the wires anymore. They're just, over at the corner market with your doctor. And that's, I've had similar experiences in the last 6 months even, with physical issues of my own and trying to find answers for them. And the first thing that they offer me are more pills. So, for me as a logician or just somebody with some common sense, wanting to stay away from drug use, popping pills or, anything that can sort of enhance my addictive personality, I want to stay away from. And so, it's just not in their repertoire. It's not in their language to speak to you about diet or, other important things. They've just been educated on, being a pill dispenser, and that's really come out of the changing images of man studies of the 80s for sure. We see a huge skyrocket in not only drug use, but the amount of drugs that comes into the system, and so just wanted to add that.
Every street corner, fully legitimized, fully backed by the the law. And I once met a police officer, and I said to him, I said, I have a crime that I'd like to, report. And I said, there's a drug dealer right over here. I'm like, actually, I could show you about 1,000 drug dealers in town that are pushing chemicals and products that are killing people. And I showed him a document. And it just happened to be a document that had ingredients in a certain experimental product that was
right.
incredibly rushed over the past few years. And the ingredient was SM-102, and I had the chemical, a list of the data sheet from the chemical company that makes the SM-102. And I showed him all the harm that it was causing. And I said, I'd like to report a crime. And it's CVS and Walgreens and Walmart and Target. I'm like, can you go do something about this? And he kind of was like, I get your point.
Right.
Actually, it was a guy who was still thinking, and like, he wasn't one of those like just autonomous drone like police officers where I spoke to him as a human being, another brother out here that was standing outside a 7-Eleven with this sign that I had.
Yep. Right.
COVID-19 vaccine makers are exempt from liability. And he asked me what my sign was about. And I was like, well, since you asked, and it's just amazing that these small-time drug dealers get arrested and lives ruined. And a lot of times, I mean, I'm not here to say and promote the use of drugs at all. We're not doing that. but it's just the hypocrisy that exists here. A guy selling some cannabis gets arrested and his whole entire life ruined. And meanwhile, you have an entire system, an institution built on fraud and built on petroleum based toxic pharmaceuticals that are on every single street corner. And there's these educational institutions that groom and steward and indoctrinate thousands, millions of nurses and doctors that go on to push these drugs. And it's fully legal, and it's on every street corner.
Yeah, and if you present it as a war on drugs, if you present to the world a war on drugs, then the real war on drugs, this one that you're talking about, the over-the-counter war on, drugs, gets unnoticed. It's not talked about.
It just takes a back seat, and all of it, both aspects, the legal and quote unquote illegal drug trade, they're one and the same. And they're run by the same people, governments, intelligence agencies. What was it? The guy, the second in charge of the Sinaloa drug cartel, said under oath, under testimony, that that he was working for the American government.
Right.
Pablo Escobar was working with the American government. I mean, you're talking about the CIA running the biggest drug dealer in the world.
Yep. And then you would have to ask yourself, 2 wars or 3 wars in the Fertile Crescent and the Fertile Triangle, if they were created on false pretenses, then it doesn't take much for one to figure out why they were there in the first place. And that would be to harvest drugs, harvest the opium fields. And we are living in the results of that now.
It's crazy. My community was decimated by heroin and OxyContin, and how many funerals have I been to? How many have you been to? We've all of you out there could have lost a brother, a sister, a mother, a father, from these opium wars and this fentanyl that we're seeing coming into our country. And these are, you think the government doesn't know about this? You think they're not involved? Of course they are. They were involved in the 80s with Oliver North and Iran-Contra and the CIA, that all that was exposed there. Do you think it just stopped? Of course not. It didn't stop. They're the largest drug dealers in the world. And we have these scientists and Harvard professors and Stanford professors working together on pushing illegal drugs like this. Yeah, I mean, it's insane. It's so damning.
Yep, well said.
And Tim said, well, that's my direct line to the president. So Robbie, that was when he was square haircut, and all that stuff, No. And so Rob said, president? He said, yeah. He said, what would you like to hear from the president? So Rob said, he said, how about no school tomorrow? So he said, sure.
That's Janiger's son. I just put that together right there. Did you know that? Robbie?
Yeah, I got that, yeah.
I didn't notice that until right now.
Yes, he said, by the way, he said, the young man here, he said, Robbie, he said, he would rather there was no school tomorrow. And the next day was a holiday. and Robbie, and for months, Rob said, is that fellow ever going to come back? Isn't that great? And I remember old Al Hubbard coming up to the house and with his leather pouch. He used to be he rode the circuits, boy. And he opened up his leather pouch, and in it was all the wampum and all the great stuff he had. And he was trading off. Well, he said, what do we have here for the month now, Al? And Al said, well, we've got this and that. Now, something new's coming up. How would you like a little of that? Remember?
Yeah, I remember.
Oh, God, we were waiting for you. We were waiting for you like a little lady on the prairie, waiting for the catalog to see his Roebuck catalog.
Well, I did the best I could with the tools I had.
I know. You had some good
primitive period, Al.
Al, what did you do with that $1 million check that you carried around with you? You had a check you showed me for $1 million. It was the most money I'd ever seen on a check in my life.
That's the most I've seen. It's cost me and other people a lot of money since then.
Listen, I'm not telling tales out because I know you've shown it to others as well as myself.
Well, I think I was pretty kind of proud of it, but finally got down to $100,000. And then, of course, they all went away. This all cost a lot of money because there was no bills to anyone except those that charged for it themselves. That was only a couple of hospitals and 2 or 3 clinics. But all it cost a lot of money.
Was it before inflation or after?
What?
When Sid wrote his paper on the complications, you remember that? And you said,
Here's where Janiger gets into the patient getting loose on Wilshire Boulevard.
that's what, what kind of care we should take. And I got the paper and I was thinking, what on earth went wrong? And we had a great number of people. But there was one, which I didn't put on that form, Sid, and I have to tell you, one of our people got loose. And I don't know, I have to tell you this now. And we couldn't find him, and this was Wilshire Boulevard.
In the tree.
Running, and we thought we had the thing well worked out, and the usual babysitter, the usual routine. And he was gone down Wilshire Boulevard. And we were looking all over, and I thought, my God, if this fellow doesn't come to light, we're in bad, bad shape. So I was coming back to the office and feeling kind of glum about it, when suddenly I hear somebody whistling. And I look around, I don't see anything. I look around, nobody, whistling. And there was a patient sitting up in a tree. I said, what are you doing up there? He said, it's wonderful up there. I said, well, now, don't do anything rash. I said, we'll come again. Oh, no. He said, I'll fly right down and see you. I said, no, you won't.
See, Leary isn't happy about this story being told for whatever reason.
And thank God for that, I'll tell you.
You should have joined him in the tree.
Yeah, he doesn't. He looked
In the
uncomfortable.
tree. You can see animosity throughout this film between, Huxley or Leary and Hubbard and the social scientists.
Because it's taken a long time, but it was just a few days ago that the last steps were taken to see that all the money was repaid. But it was a long battle, but all the money went back to its source.
Is that right?
Yeah, I'm sure.
Which money was that, Myron?
Well, don't you remember this? Oh, you had several of them. Thank God I didn't have to get involved in the others.
I must say to Al's credit that he never made a lot of money selling that stuff at all. He was a great trader, though. He'd say, how about a little almost pure tetrahydrocannabinol? In those days, you had it was kind of a viscous, oil. Remember that stuff in tubes?
Yeah.
Now, what have you got to offer?
Well, now, how do you figure this belonged business, Byron?
What?
Went back to where it belonged. How do you figure it?
From the source. The person who furnished the money got it back.
How?
Well, you know how. But it's not a matter for I don't think it's a matter for public record.
So you can see Willis Herman there in behind the guy with the glasses. He doesn't say a word through this whole thing.
That interested me a lot, actually, that he didn't say a word.
It's a word.
Pause it real quick. Pause it real quick. Actually, let it go to where it pans on Hubbard real quick. I think it'll go back to him.
Johnny Appleseed?
Yeah, I want to just talk about him a minute.
LSD contributed mightily, I think, was the whole upsurge in the study of the chemistry of the brain.
Yeah.
I think that had a lot to do with it, and although it may have happened, I think LSD accelerated it.
Yeah, it's interesting that was in writing the book. That's part of it.
Right there. Pause it there. So they start waxing poetic. Oscar, Oz, Janiger there, reminiscing about when Al Hubbard would come up with his little pouch of goodies, always with something new, right? And let's just drill this home real quick. He was Canadian Special Services, worked for the United States Justice Department, United States Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. That's the infamous ATF.
Right.
Stop and think about that out there for a second.
Mm-hmm.
This guy is going around dropping acid, that acid messiah, right? As we talked about earlier, the Johnny Appleseed of LSD, as he's called, dropping acid everywhere and giving these social researchers and scientists and professors, psychiatrists, psychologists, giving them these substances. And he's also working for the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives.
The contradiction.
And worked for Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, the precursor to the CIA.
Yeah.
I wanted to point that out and drill that home. This guy carrying around this goodie bag of psychoactive substances,
and he would have had to have been working with the Canadian government too to be able to live in Canada and do what he was doing. There's no doubt in my mind. He's at least a double agent.
So, I mean, I just wanted to point that out. There's a lot of information out there about him. You guys can, kind of take it and run with it. But obviously, you're seeing him in this room. Very, very, damning, as we've said a few times.
Mm-hmm.
That I think the clinicians somehow, if not disdain that, at least somehow that doesn't seem to be an area of terrible concern to them, and
they wouldn't. Clinician wouldn't care.
Of what I think is this equally important impact of LSD, which was on accelerating the entire notion of the neurochemistry of the brain and how the brain processes emotion. And so we're trying to
how the brain processes emotion.
It's going to take a whole other group of people to look at that more critically. But I think, as you say, that chapter is most importantly well worth written entirely. I think it was LSD with serotonin, which in turn gave rise perhaps to the early hypotheses of the brain amines in relation to affective disorders.
And Leary found this conversation too much, I suppose, and he's off in the kitchen now having conversations with somebody else.
LSD probably had the most effect on the larger population that has never even taken it, to the marginal participation in the counterculture movement, which I attribute largely to LSD. I'm not attributing it necessarily, but it was, I think, a necessary condition.
Bill,
necessary condition.
Bill, when we were running our subjects, about the third or fourth subject was an artist. And he saw a Kachina doll that was sitting on the shelf, and he said, I must draw something. I've got to look at something. I've got to paint it. So we took the doll off the shelf, and he began to sketch it in, sort of haphazard way as you do, he couldn't control it very well. And when he was through with the experience, he said, this is the most important artistic experience that I've ever had. He said, do you mind if I tell other artists about it? Well, we weren't quite prepared for this. I had no idea that the artist, was going to be any more affected than anyone else. And he then began to bring in his friends, and before long, it was almost as if the entire project would be inundated with artists. That's how completely eager and absolutely interested they were in taking it.
Sure.
And we had to really limit the number of artists. So at least from their point of view, and then we have a very elaborate record of what the artists had said and the follow-up, as you know, because you used some of that data. And the artists seemed to derive an enormous amount of interest and of help from the experience with LSD among all the others.
Now, artists, that's an interesting aspect too, because if you're paying attention to our other work, we are showing how German expressionism, abstract expressionism, data, cubism, futurism, how all of these artistic movements that are under the umbrella of German expressionism or French expressionism were used as psychological manipulation through the 1913 Armory Show, but also in the Weimar Republic. And artists, if it wasn't well known to Janiger, was very well known to the other social scientists and the controllers of society to be highly influential, going all the way back to the Committee on Public Information to start to get Americans to endorse United States involvement in World War I. They had hired all of the most famous, well-known artists in America, including those that were doing, cover art for the Saturday Evening Post, to create the famous "I Want You" propaganda poster and all of this other anti-German, pro-Western propaganda. So they're talking about it happening in the 60s, just the same as it did, 40 years before that.
The worst reactors we had were the psychiatrists, and the second were the ministers. I mean, they were not. I mean, there was nothing gravely serious, but they didn't have good reactions.
So Willis Harman just left the room there.
Yep. And the 2 or 3 rabbis and several. We had, I think, 2 Catholic priests.
But in general, artists have more fun than ministers, don't they?
Well, they may have more fun, but then we're going back to your original thesis.
They do more good then. They move the human race farther ahead. Artists do, I think.
Well, psychedelic art is still something that has to be evaluated. It's an unproven thing in a way. But
so is psychology, psychiatry,
painting the doll
biology,
and painting it afterwards at a time when they had
genetics,
Darwinism, genetics,
well, some of course
evolution,
but not very rapidly. And so
now they choose to focus in on who's sitting over here, but Willis Harman just left the room.
How these people handle it under the drug. And if they took it a number of times, they developed a facility so they could deal with it and they could paint fairly decently under it.
You got one with the leaf.
Yeah, that one
with the leaf. An old friend of mine sent me a copy of that.
Yeah, I'll have to talk to you.
Yeah, I'd like to understand that a little better. With the doll, you say you first had them paint it before they'd taken LSD, and then during.
Yes.
And how about, did you do any after?
Yes. There was some.
Of course they would.
Because, I'd be interested there whether they felt that they had some enhanced ability afterward, but they,
And this speaks to Purcell's studies too.
No means it was just this whole sense of opening up, and having more choices, and being able to see things much more. Many more permutations and ideas.
She didn't look like she was having much fun.
No, the women don't.
Would you all like to have something to eat?
Did you see? It's over now, I think.
Yes, that signals kind of the end of the video is when they all go to eat. So what I wanted to touch on first here is Willis Harman.
Yes,
I can get an image of him up here. So Willis Harman. Can I flip between tabs? Can you see the changing images of man now? So there's his name, Willis Harman, as it says it's edited, but once you get into the article, let's see here. I might say it at the bottom. No, somewhere along here it says he's the director. And so another interesting aspect here, let's make that bigger, is the publisher is Robert Maxwell, MC. Now, I know a Robert Maxwell, Ghislaine Maxwell's father, and he's a triple, quadruple agent. I'm not sure if this is the same Robert Maxwell, but that's very interesting. And then we have, just in the first couple pages, the System Science and World Order Library and some of the other works that have been written about controlling society, and we see Markley and Harman as the authors of Changing Images of Man there. And then we see Willis Harman.
What did it say? System science and What was the phrasing on that?
World Order. System.
And World Order Library.
So explorations of world order. It's all there in front of you. You know.
Coming out of Stanford Research Institute.
Yeah. Okay, and then so this is the other part I wanted to just point out is that Willis Harman on the actual inside the book is credited with being the project supervisor. So I strongly encourage people to read this book and also read A Brave New World or watch the video that Andy was talking about earlier, because just doing those two things and understanding some of the people that were involved in that should be opening your eyes immediately. So Willis Harman's associated with the Human Potential Movement. If you've read How Huxley Hijacked Hollywood, you can understand how that comes from Esalen and some other people too, but generally within that milieu. And I thought I had an image of his face here just so that everybody could see that the face matches, but he's left the room as well, so you'll have to just trust me on that or do your research there as well. It shows that Harman recruited Alfred Matthew Hubbard to the Alternative Futures Project. So, he's in this room with all of these MK Ultra doctors. He doesn't say a word, but he is the project director of the Stanford Research Institute Changing Images of Man study that by 79, it's only, I think the first Changing Images of Man was in the 70s, and then the conclusion of it was in the 80s. So this 79 MK Ultra reunion meeting is happening between the two of those. So that's very interesting.
Yeah, they're all sort of contributing in their own way to, breaking down or what people thought the idea of man was, and recreating this new version of it.
Yeah, and then we talk about abstract expressionism. It's not impressionism now. It's an outward flow of energy, expressionism. And what we see through the abstract expressionist movement is the abstraction of the image of man. Literally, when you look at abstract art, and especially when they portray a human figure in it, it is completely fragmented. So this is how art, just a single picture painting, can really influence. These guys knew that too. And so one of the other discoveries since between part 1 and part 2 that I made was that there was also another meeting, the Psychedelics Colloquium, in 1977. So 2 years before this MK Ultra reunion, the same thing was happening. I encourage everybody to go and check this out. The pictures of all the same people are there, and I believe even Gordon Wasson was at this one. I could be wrong.
Really? Okay.
But I could be wrong, but that seems to be the image.
Hoffman was there.
Yep, he's definitely there.
Metzner. That name, William McLaughlin, that was referenced by Janiger.
Willis Harman's there. Albert Hoffman's there. Janiger's there.
Allen Ginsberg. That's
Allen Ginsberg's the name I was trying to come up with. He's there.
Baba Ramdas. Yeah.
Okay. So definitely something to look further into.
Yeah, for sure. Wow.
Yeah.
What a great discussion here today. Hope you got anything else that you want to highlight? I think
do you want to end it with the Brave New World?
I think so. I got that teed up here. I got that.
Cool.
I think we're gonna end it here. Just encourage you all out there to stay strong. Hope you're all doing well. Thanks for hanging on with us. Hope you got some value and some benefit from that. And find your way to bulletproofpub.com. Check out Duane on YouTube at the History of Propaganda. Amazing
work. Andy to go within to get out.
Thank you guys. Appreciate that. I think, until next time, just keep working on yourselves. Have the courage to look into some of these things. It's really important to understand how we got here. I'm torn on this in many ways too, because I've gotten some benefit out of out of mushrooms. And sometimes I'm still processing what happened, and was I misled? Was I suggested to have a certain type of experience? And how is that affecting me today? But I think it did some benefit for me in my life, but I encourage extreme caution to anybody out there before you kind of embark on this journey. And yeah, I just you guys are all beautiful and powerful out there. Your minds are capable of enduring, and work on yourselves. I think we can change this thing. And until next time, I think I want to show you. You guys have to see this. Maybe we'll just keep it open. Just keep it open for a minute. But this is probably one of my favorite scenes. This movie's really disturbing. This is Brave New World, based off of the Aldous Huxley's Brave New World novel, and it's a great scene here. Check this out.
Line for Soma distribution. Thank you.
Oh, brave new world.
In line, everybody. That's it, everyone. In line.
This Soma is bad. It's poison. It hurts you.
Please don't do that,
take
Mr.
any.
Savage.
Soma makes you into slaves. It robs you of everything magical and special within you.
Mr. Savage, please don't do that.
You can never be free until you're free of Soma.
Everyone be calm. There is an ample supply of Soma enough for everyone.
I'm not going to let you take any more. Now listen to me. Listen to me. Don't you want to feel alive? Don't you want to feel free? Don't you want to feel the blood coursing in your veins?
Mr. Savage, don't do that.
The dark reset eyes, too. I see it more and more with that time.
What's that?
Well, just the dark inset eyes of all of these people that are queuing up for the Soma. I'm starting to see that a lot more in real life.
Yeah, those are the in this society. These are the deltas and the epsilons, I believe.
Yeah.
Who just mindlessly walk around in the society and obviously don't question the nature of their reality. And I mean, none of the characters really in this society, save one or two maybe, are really kind of, asking questions. But the deltas and the epsilon specifically were, mindless drones in this
consumers.
Consumers, exactly.
Mindless consumers.
Yes. And there you see the machine that's distributing the Soma here in the back. And I think Duane and I really like this scene because we feel like John Savage here in this particular scene. Like we're just trying to warn you. From my own personal experience, having gone this route of medication after medication after medication after medication, totally inundated and obsessed with escaping from this reality because of, emotional pain, trauma in childhood, all of the things that many of you out there are experiencing, dealing with, and I feel like him in the scene, where I'm trying to, you see the care in the character here.
And he makes a great argument because it's on a human level. He's not attacking those people with his knowledge. He understands the real problem, and he's just trying to educate. And it's on a human level, and I like how he takes it in the solution into his own hands.
Don't you want to feel the blood coursing?
There's some important lines there.
I know, man. I'm gonna go back into this, study it, and
It's poison.
It's poison.
Mr. Savage. Mr. Savage, please. Mr. Savage, they need their Soma.
No, they don't.
Emergency. Heliofusion plant number 3. Send solidarity forces immediately.
Oh yeah, and then the other guys come to his aid, but
yeah,
he gets attacked. He gets
you won't
totally
get a
attacked.
spoiler alert, but definitely go check that movie out. It's a little long, but it certainly will be an eye opener for everybody.
Yeah, it's free on YouTube. I think keep in mind it's not some type of dystopian warning. And this movie was made 1980, right? This is kind of the reality we live in, right? They're actually starting to normalize, and there's companies that are starting to say, oh, we can create your baby in this incubator outside of your womb. And
these are happening today. Yep.
CRISPR technology, gene editing, and gene alteration technology. And we just saw the biggest experimental gene therapy ever in the world take place in 2020.
They're exempt from liability.
No liability at all. And yeah, it was a pleasure, Duane. Thanks for that. Thanks for that stewardship and education there. So much more to get into, and look forward to the next one.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you very much, Andy.
Thank you, brother. Yeah. I think you got to end the recording this time.
Well, yeah, I probably do.
My computer. Folks, that
millions of dollars would be spent on LSD research at universities throughout the country, and word would begin to spread on campus about this so-called mind-blowing drug. And suddenly, there was the counterculture of the 60s.
I give the CIA a total credit for sponsoring and initiating the entire consciousness movement, counterculture events of the 1960s.
Dr. Timothy Leary, the 1960s Johnny Appleseed of LSD.
The CIA funded and supported and encouraged hundreds of young psychiatrists to experiment with this drug.